Well, hey, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in with us today. My name's Seth. I'm one of the pastors here, and I just am so grateful for you giving a little bit of your time to us. You know, I want to start off by talking about something that I heard years ago, and I think it's really true, and I think you're going to be able to relate to it pretty easily, and that's that every person is in one of three places. We're either about to enter into a storm, we're in the middle of a storm, or we just got out of a storm. See what I'm talking about? We can all relate to that, especially right now, because we, as a country, are in the middle of a storm together right now, aren't we? I mean, we're in the middle of a storm together, and it's actually not just our country, it's our whole world. Our whole world is in the middle of a storm together, and we don't really experience a lot together anymore, do we? I mean, really, elections, but we don't really experience that together because we are so polarized in our country. They're at opposite ends of the spectrum. And so, I mean, you know, technology, it has just brought this individualistic society. We don't even watch television shows together anymore. I remember back when I was, I think, a senior in high school, the final episode of Seinfeld. And people were like racing home to make sure that they were there on time because you had to watch television when it was on. Anybody remember that? Remember those days? Or remember when you had to go to church when it was actually happening? Thankfully, we don't have to do that right now because we can't be together. But, you know, now we're all watching online and you know, the truth is we're just kind of all in the same boat together with one another through this. And the pandemic has confirmed for many of us, and for those of you who are kind of, you know, maybe well-prepared or detail-oriented, dare I say, control freaks, the pandemic has confirmed something that you have feared your whole life. And that is that as much as we try to control the world around us, which we try to do, don't we? I mean, we try to control our kids. We try to control their behavior. We try to control our spouses, our boyfriend and girlfriend. We try to convince our parents to, you know, fund our bad ideas and to financially support us. We try to control our experiences. We try to control our retirement, our vacation. We try to control so many things. But the thing this pandemic has confirmed for all of us is that as much as we try to control the world around us, we're not in control, are we? We're not. I mean, that's just kind of it. And the thing is that it's a little bit unsettling. All of us, I mean, I'm feeling unsettled. My guess is you're probably feeling at least a little bit unsettled because we don't know when our kids are going to go back to school. We don't know when businesses are going to reopen. We don't know when people will take this seriously and do a good job social distancing. We don't know when life is going to be rebooted and things can go back to normal. We don't know when isolation is going to be over. We don't know what's going to happen to our retirement. I mean, honestly, right now, in this season that we're in as a country, we are so painfully aware of how out of control we are. In fact, I want to ask you to do something, play along. This is an all skate, regardless of where you are. If you've got headphones on and you're in the midst of a room of a couple people, because you're not supposed to be in a room of big people. But what I want you to do is just, if you feel a little bit out of control, if you can relate to what I just said, I just want you to raise your hand, right? Raise it with me, loud and proud. You know, raise it with me. We are in this together. In fact, never in my lifetime have I ever experienced this to this degree or magnitude. I heard somebody say it's kind of like 9/11 and the economic meltdown of 2008 all combined into one. Never in my lifetime have I experienced this kind of unsettledness. And we as Americans, you know, I mean, life doesn't happen to us. We happen to life. We grab the bull by the horns. It's kind of like Chuck Norris. When the boogeyman goes to sleep every night, he checks his closet for Chuck Norris. I mean, that's what we do as Americans. We grab the bull by the horns. We take control. Americans aren't offensive. We're not defensive, rather. We're offensive. But the problem is right now, we're not in control. We are not in control. And perhaps the scariest thing for all of us is that no one seems to be in control. No one does. I mean, nobody knows. Nobody knows how long it's going to last. Nobody knows if there will be a cure or when there will be a cure, if there can be a prevention. It just feels like we're sitting ducks and we're getting more anxious because of our collective helplessness. And I'm telling you, it's in the middle of this that I think sometimes we forget something that we've probably known all along. I don't think this is going to come as a surprise. In fact, if you're home taking notes, you're probably not even going to take notes on this. But it's absolutely true, and that's that storms in life, they're inevitable, aren't they? I mean, we know that from personal experiences. You know that from when you were a kid in school, or if you're a student right now and you drop your tray in the lunchroom and all of a sudden everybody's looking at you and people are making fun of you, or something happens to you. You know it from work, if you lose a job, if you don't get the promotion. We know it with our health, when we get the diagnosis, or when we're not recovering the way we want to be recovered, or when something happens, when somebody dies. We know that storms in life are inevitable, but do you know what else we know? Storms in life are inevitable and they're unpredictable. We could say they're kind of predictably unpredictable. We never know when they're going to come. We just know that they are going to come. I'll never forget a storm that I went through when I was 21 years old. It was summer before my senior year in college, and I had been at work. I was living at home with my parents for the summer. And when I walked in the door, my parents greeted me to let me know that my older cousin, who was about a year and a half older than I was, had been killed in a car accident that day. It was 2 days before his 23rd birthday. I had no idea. All this had taken place during the day, and I had no idea what was going on. And it's in those moments when the storms rage, the inevitable, unexpected storms come, that you begin to reevaluate. You begin to ask yourself questions. I mean, think for us. I mean, back in November, or just even backtrack our timeline to the beginning of March, none of us knew. I mean, we had a strong economy. There was low unemployment. Prosperity was on the rise. I mean, life was kind of going as normal. People were headed out on spring break. And then, boom, I mean, it just happened. It just happened. And just a few weeks later, look where we are now. Inevitable and unpredictable. And it's because of this storm we're beginning this brand new series today called Anchored in the Storm. And to be honest with you, normally we have our series planned out 3 to 4 weeks at least in advance, sometimes months in advance. This one we're just kind of figuring out. We're figuring it out together. And it's not just for you, it's for me also. As we try and determine what to do with what's going on around us, what to do with what's going on inside of us. And I hope that this series is helpful to you, and I hope that it can be an encouragement to you in the midst of this storm that we are all going through right now. Now, as we start, I want to talk about something that we all eventually figure out, and it doesn't matter if you're young or you're old. It's not really a Christian thing or a non-Christian thing, a rich thing or poor thing, It's just kind of a people thing. And that's that when storms come, we suddenly want to anchor our life to something. Right? I mean, when the storms come, you want to get stabilized so that you're not blown away. I mean, that's what we do with boats. You know what an anchor is? It's something that moors a vessel to the bottom of the sea. We could say it like this. An anchor is something that provides stability. It provides stability and confidence in an otherwise uncertain situation. And the truth is that people, like boats, need to be anchored. And my guess is, in the recent days, you've probably, just like me, we've all tried to figure out what to anchor ourselves to. Sometimes we anchor ourselves by trying to numb our pain with alcohol or pornography or something else. Sometimes we anchor ourselves by hoarding resources because there's something we can control. So when we see toilet paper at the store, we go out and buy it, or paper towels, or whatever that resource is that you just kind of feel like you need. Sometimes we anchor ourselves to the news as we're thinking about, how can I be prepared? How can I know what's coming? Or maybe hoping that there's good news. We anchor ourselves to stock market and business. We anchor ourselves to science, hoping that there's going to be some sort of a cure. Sometimes we anchor ourselves to relationships, and we just kind of cling and we're craving social media or Zoom meetings or opportunities to just somehow be anchored to someone. And so my question for you is, in light of all of that, what are you anchoring yourself to in this storm? Really, what are you anchoring yourself to in this storm? Maybe you've not even taken the time to think about it. See, the thing is, when life is great, and let's just be honest, for Americans, life has been great for a while. I mean, it really has. And when life is great, anchors don't really matter. When the sun's out and it's smooth sailing, what we need to anchor ourselves to doesn't really matter. And so we anchor ourselves to things like instant gratification, or to pleasure, or to entertainment, or to sports, or to our kids and their activities, and to our identities, to popularity and likes on social media. We anchor ourselves to those things. But when storms rage, when things begin to fall apart, those things that we have anchored ourselves to in the past, they seemingly come up short and they don't fulfill us the way that we think they fulfill us. And right now, a storm is raging in our country, and many of us, we just don't know what to do because we've been anchored to the wrong thing. In fact, many of us are missing something that I've heard called anchor faith. Anchor faith, and here's what anchor faith is. It's faith in your anchor. Kind of obvious, right? Faith in your anchor when a storm comes. It's having trust, it's having confidence that your boat, or in this case your life, is anchored to something that will hold you. And it will keep you from being destroyed in the tempestuous storm that we find ourselves in right now. So the question I want to ask you, and I want you to think about with me over the next kind of several minutes, is do you know what to anchor yourself to in the middle of this storm? Do you know? Now, you may not know, and if you don't know, I don't want you to feel bad about that. This isn't about guilt, and I want you to know you're not alone. There are many people right now who are just struggling and saying, what do I anchor myself to? And today, I'm going to talk about that a little bit, and I hope to give you a little bit of hope as we look at a fascinating text that comes from the Jewish scriptures. Now, in Christianity, we refer to the Jewish scriptures as the Old Testament, but for the Jewish people, it's still even just their scriptures. And there's a particular book that's called Ecclesiastes, and it's written in the spirit of King Solomon. Now, King Solomon was the wisest king the world has ever known, perhaps the wisest person next to Jesus the world has ever known. And he was the son of King David, the most famous king the nation of Israel ever knew. You know David because he had a sling and a stone, and he killed Goliath, the giant. And so Solomon, he was king during this golden age of Israel where there was so much wealth, there was so much abundance. Things were going so well. And with wealth, wealth buys access because you've got extra free time and you have, resources to do essentially whatever it is that you want to do. And what we discover is that Solomon did whatever Solomon wanted to do because he had so much. And in the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon is really wrestling with what to anchor himself to. We can relate to that. Because so many of us, we've had so much. Life has been so smooth sailing, and now, when we're in the middle of a storm, we're trying to figure out what in the world do I anchor myself to? How do I make sense of life? And so Solomon, he was trying to do that, and here's what he said. He said, meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. It's like, wow, talk about negative. But here's what Solomon was saying. He says, look, everything in life, it's kind of a delusion. And the reason it's a delusion is because Solomon, as we're about to see, comes to the conclusion that things on earth are temporary. Things on earth are temporary. See, with everything that Solomon had, and again, he was perhaps the wealthiest human in the history of mankind. With everything that Solomon had, there was one thing that eluded him. It was anchor faith. It was confidence that when a storm came, his life would be secure. Now, he described all these things by talking about them as being under the sun. Back in January, if you've been a part of our church, Pastor Dan, he gave a sermon in Ecclesiastes, and he talked about this concept of under the sun. It's the things under the earth. And the point that Solomon's making is that the things that are under the sun, all the things on this earth, they're simply temporary. He goes on. Here's what he says. In chapter 2, he said, I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure. So he's trying to find something to anchor himself to. I'll test you with pleasure to find out what's good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Then he tried something else. He said, laughter, I said, it's madness. And what does pleasure accomplish? He says, I tried cheering myself with wine, embracing folly. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. He says, I tried to figure it out. In fact, I left no pleasure rock unturned. I didn't withhold anything from myself. He said, I denied myself nothing. Didn't withhold anything my eyes desired. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. Solomon took hedonism to the max. He had harem. He had, hundreds of wives and concubines. He had pleasures that you and I couldn't imagine and probably wouldn't even want to imagine, right? I mean, he built buildings, he grew vineyards and gardens. He had a life of wealth beyond comprehension. And even in the midst of that, here was his conclusion. He says, "Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything, not some things, everything was meaningless. A chasing after the wind, nothing was gained under the sun." There was no purpose to it, Solomon said. It didn't resolve this inner need to cling to something worthwhile, to anchor himself into something worthwhile. None of those things provided him with anchor faith. So he tried leaning himself into something else. He tried wisdom. That was the next thing. He tried it too. He says, "The wise have eyes in their heads while the fool walks in the darkness." So, it's good to be wise. He said, "But I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them all." Wisdom is good on this earth, but the problem is we all have the same fate. And do you know what the fate is? It's death. It's death. Every living thing has an expiration date. Every living thing dies. And so Solomon says, look, wisdom, as good as it is and as important as it is in a person's life, it still comes to the same end. We all eventually die. So he continued, he says, "Then I said to myself, the fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain by being wise? I said to myself, this too is meaningless, for the wise, like the fool, will not be long remembered. The days have already come when both have been forgotten. Like the fool, the wise too must die." Yee. That's like pessimistic, right? Or maybe it's just honest. Maybe it's just this honest recognition that everything that's living eventually dies. The wise person and the foolish person. So he realized that pleasure and building and acquiring wouldn't earn him anything, so he decided to kind of lean into his wealth and try wealth because the rest of those failed. Now, this was 3,000 years ago, but look at the wisdom behind what he says. He says, "For the wise, or whoever rather loves money, never has enough." Whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. And he said, this too is meaningless because even pleasure, even wealth, even, building and acquiring, they all fail. And let's just be honest for a minute. Hasn't the pandemic taught us that? That wealth fails? In a matter of minutes, how far did the stock market fall? They had to close its trading on multiple days because wealth ultimately fails. And what about pleasure? We're not even allowed to go out and be around other people. There's not even opportunity, and pleasure fails. Medicine, as wonderful and as thankful as I am for the doctors and the nurses and the medical workers, science isn't exact. It's just that. It's science. It's helpful, and I'm so thankful. But it hasn't come up with a solution yet. It hasn't come up with a cure yet. Governments, they fail us, don't they? So Solomon says we can't anchor ourselves to these things. So what do we do? What do we do? What do we anchor ourselves to? Or perhaps who do we anchor ourselves to? Because Solomon came to a really important conclusion at the end of all this. And here's what he said. He says, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. He says, start young. Start young. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth. In fact, if you're watching with us today or listening in and you're a young person under the age of 30, particularly those of you who are under the age of 18, high schoolers, middle schoolers, pay really close attention to this because I realize that, remembering your Creator right now is probably not exactly high on your priority list, right? You're remembering your friends, you're remembering fun, you're remembering, what you can get away with. You're not thinking about God's no fun policy or the Creator's no fun policy. Because that's what it feels like. God's just out there to keep you from living life to the full. But what Solomon's going to say here, is that if you want to be wise, which is a good idea, by the way, even though the same fate comes to the wise and the foolish, at least be wise on this earth because foolishness is very, very costly. He says, if you want to be wise, then you need to remember the Creator in the days of your youth. He goes on, he says, before the days of trouble come, and the years approach when you will say, I find no pleasure in them. He says, remember the Creator before it's too late. Remember the Creator before you get to your midlife crisis. Those of you who are like 35, 40 and above, you know what that's like. You know that midlife crisis when you've been living your life and you've been going day to day and you've just kind of been hanging out and doing whatever, and you realize that you've been anchored to something that can't really hold you secure. You've been anchored to something that isn't strong enough to help you sustain whatever storm it is that you're in, and particularly this current storm that we're in. And so Solomon says, look, it is so important. Figure this out. Young people, figure this out before it's too late. Because when you get to this point, it's too late. When you get to this point, there's a feeling of hopelessness. So remember your Creator in the days of your youth before the days of trouble come. He says, before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars grow dark, that's when you start losing your eyesight and the clouds return after the rain. He says, when the keepers of the house, that's your hands, tremble, and the strong men stoop, he's referring to your legs, when the grinders cease because they are few. In other words, when your teeth start falling out and you can't chew anymore, and those looking through the windows grow dim. He's talking about how as people get older, the twinkle kind of loses or goes away from their eye. He says when the doors to the street are closed and the sound of grinding fades, when your hearing starts to go, when the people rise up at the sound of birds, but all their songs grow faint. It's like this strange paradox of you can't hear, but strange noises wake you up at night and you can't fall back to sleep. He goes on, he says, when people are afraid of heights and of dangers in the streets, when you're no longer young and strong and fearless, when suddenly you start being fearful, when the almond tree blossoms, when your hair turns white and the grasshopper drags itself along, when your bones and your joints just aren't really working as well, and desire is no longer stirred, then people go to their eternal home and mourners go about the streets. To those of you who are watching and with us today, I mean, you have the wisdom of time. You've had the opportunity to look back. You've experienced life a little bit, and you can relate to what Solomon has said because you've seen storms come and go. You've known recessions. You've seen death. You've held on to friendships in middle school or high school or in earlier years who were so important to you, and then you've just kind of been disconnected over time, and those things that were so important and so fulfilling in times of your life just aren't anymore. And then likes on social media and all that stuff, I mean, it's just so fleeting because you've seen the inevitable, unpredictable storms of life come and go. And over time, you begin to know the importance of anchoring yourself to something that isn't under the sun, something that doesn't have an expiration date, something that lasts, which is why Solomon says, remember him. Remember him. Remember your Creator before the silver cord is severed and the golden bowl is broken. Remember him before your life is taken from you, before the pitcher is shattered at the spring, because once it's shattered, you don't put it back together again. Once it's shattered, it's too late, he says, and the wheel broken at the well, and the dust returns to the ground it came from, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. In other words, remember the Creator before you realize the fate of all things, before you experience the fate of all things. So here's the thing Solomon was talking about, and my guess is you kind of begin to know this over time, right? It's this whole circle of life thing. You know how the circle of life works? It works that you wake up, you eat, you go to work, you eat, you go back to work, you go home, you eat, hang out for a little bit, and then you go to bed. And then the next day you wake up and you eat, and you go to work and you eat, and you go back to work, and then you go home and you eat, and you hang out for a little bit, and you go to bed. And then the next day you wake up and you eat, you go to work, and you get it. You live the cycle, and then eventually you die, and they put you in the ground, and somebody, dirt gets placed over you, and grass grows, and a cow comes and eats the grass, and somebody needs something to eat, so they slaughter the cow, and they eat, and they go to work, and they eat, and they go to work, and they go back home, and they eat, and they hang out for a while and go to bed. And the cycle just kind of continues on and on and on, and it's this endless cycle of life and death, and the same fate comes to them all, and it's all very meaningless under the sun. What happens here on earth, Solomon says, is so very meaningless when we anchor ourselves to it, but we can anchor ourselves to something that is not under the sun. And that's the conclusion Solomon comes to at the end. Here's what he said. He says, now all has been heard. I think it's significant when he says all has been heard, because if all has been heard, Solomon, I mean, this is a big all, right? I mean, Solomon experienced all. I can't even imagine all that Solomon experienced, all that I don't even want to imagine, right? But here's the conclusion of the matter, he says. Now, all has been heard. Here's the conclusion of the matter. Fear God. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. Fear the one who isn't under the sun. Fear the one who isn't under the sun. Fear. When you fear him, what you'll do is you'll begin to pay attention to his commands, and you'll realize that his commands aren't there for no fun. They're not there to, ruin your life. They're actually there to give you life. They're there to protect you and to watch over you and to anchor you for when the storm comes. And Solomon would say, if you can anchor yourself to God, which I realize isn't like a real popular thing to say, right? Because America, at least, we're in this kind of post-Christian, post-God, post-Jesus culture. But here's the thing, when you anchor yourself to nothing, or when you anchor yourself to driftwood, or when you anchor yourself to pleasure or wealth, or all the things that Solomon talked about, it leaves you drifting with nothing to hold on to. In fact, 1,000 years after Solomon came, the world changed. The world was a significantly different place. The nation of Israel was now a nation living inside of a nation. They'd been conquered by the Romans. They were subject to Caesar, and it was into that cultural context that a Jewish carpenter was born, and his name was Jesus of Nazareth. And as Jesus grew up and as he began to teach and preach, he had a very famous collection of sermons called the Sermon on the Mount. It probably wasn't one sermon, but a grouping of sermons. And in it, Jesus taught people how to live, how to anchor themselves. He talked about how blessed are not the wealthy, but blessed are the poor in spirit. Not blessed are those who are happy all the time, but blessed are the mourners, or the meek, or those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers. And he gave instructions on how to live life and how to be generous and how not to be anxious and how to just experience and live life to the full. And then he ended with an instruction that will no doubt that will not be a surprise to you. I have no doubt that it won't be a surprise to you. It's something that's very familiar whether you grew up in church or not. Here's what Jesus said. He says, therefore, in light of all that I've just taught you, in light of all that I've just said, he says, therefore, everyone, not some people, not most people, but all people, everyone who hears these words of mine or these teachings of mine and puts them into practice. In other words, doesn't just hear them, but actually does something with them. Doesn't just hear them and say, oh, those are nice, I really like those, but actually begins to apply them to their lives. Everyone who hears these words and puts them into practice, he says, is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And you know what happened? He says the rain came down and the streams rose and the winds blew and beat against that house. In other words, the inevitable, unexpected storms of life came. Yet, the house, did not fall because, here's why, because it had its foundation on the rock. See, it wasn't just anchored to something, it was anchored to the right thing. And what Jesus was saying is that if you want to storm-proof your life, you've got to be anchored to the right thing, because when you're anchored to the right thing and you have anchor faith, you can withstand any storm that comes your way. And he made this amazing promise. He says, if you will take the words of mine, the things that I am teaching you, and if you will anchor your life to them, you will be anchoring yourself to bedrock. But then he went on to say this, because he says not everyone's going to do that. He said, but everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice, whether because they didn't like the words or because they just, didn't feel like putting them into practice, whoever does not put them into practice is like a foolish man, like a fool who built his house on the sand. Now, here's the thing about building your house on the sand. It's pretty, isn't it? There's a nice view. You get to hear the ocean. It's passionate. It's fun. It's fantastic until the inevitable, unpredictable storm comes, because it will come. And Jesus said, the rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. There came the storm. and it fell with a great crash. The devastation was devastating. But you know what else it was? It was predictable. It was predictable because the storm was going to come, and the thing that the house was built on was not solid. It was fun while it lasted, but it didn't last. Here's what I want you to know. If you don't take anything else from today, I hope you will walk away with this, that what your life is anchored to matters. What your life is anchored to matters. If you anchor your life to the wrong thing, then the storm will bring destruction. But here's the good news. Anchor yourself to the right thing, and you can survive anything. Because storms are inevitable and they are unpredictable. We don't know how long, we don't know when, we don't know how great the devastation will be, but we do know that what we're anchored to matters. And I may not know you personally, but here's something I know about you because it's true of every person on the planet. That is that your life, it's anchored to something. I mean, it's true for all of us. I'm telling you, as I said earlier, you are anchored to something right now, whether it's the 24-hour news, whether it's television, whether it's social media and likes, whether it's politicians or money or people or your health. I mean, your life is anchored to something, but here's the question. Is it the right thing? Is it the right thing? Does it give you anchor faith? Does it give you confidence that you will be able to withstand the storm? Or do you find yourself lying awake at night, wondering, concerned, scared, anxious? And if that's the case, then you've anchored yourself to the wrong thing. There's a fascinating article instructing boat owners how to anchor their boats for the storm. It's written by a person named Kim Brown. And she wrote this article, 8 Steps to Anchoring in a Storm. And here's what she said. She said, many sailors fail to understand the art of anchoring. There's an art to it. I think that people assume it's easy or that it's just one of those things that comes natural. If you have any doubt, let me pause there and emphasize that. If you have any doubt about your knowledge on anchoring and or whether or not your ground tackle is correct for your boat, she says this is one aspect where ignorance is not bliss. Nothing is worse. Nothing is worse than being stuck on a boat in high winds for 48 or 60 hours, not having anchor faith. To reduce fear and be able to sleep at night, you want to know that you have an anchor that will keep you safe. And I would add to that nothing is worse than a life that faces inevitable, unpredictable storms without anchor faith. In fact, let me say it again. Your life is anchored to something. Is it the right thing? Only you can answer that. I can't answer for you. But if you want to reduce your fear, if you want to get rid of anxiousness, if you want to be able to sleep at night, I've got to encourage you. You've got to anchor yourself to something that's worthwhile. Because a good anchor is useless if you're not tied to it. A good anchor is useless if you're not tied to it. If you're afraid, if you're restless, if you are floating aimlessly, you need to spend some time figuring out what you're anchored to. I'm telling you, your life is anchored to something. And the good news is that Jesus made an incredible promise. He said, if you anchor yourself to me, you'll be able to survive any storm. So I hope this week you will begin asking yourself that question. What is my life anchored to? Am I anchored to the right thing? The good news is, we've got a little extra time on our hands, many of us. And you've got some time to think about that and to be processing, is the thing I'm anchoring myself to providing me with anchor faith? Or am I just drifting? Am I just drifting? Am I just wondering? Am I anxious? Am I sleepless? I'm telling you, my friends, God wants to provide anchor faith to you. And throughout this series, we're going to be talking about how to go about doing that. But before we get there, I want you to spend some time asking yourself, What am I anchoring my life to, and is it worth it? Is it worth it? If you've got questions in relation to this, we've got a new chat bot on our website. You can reach out to us. It'll send us direct messages and we can talk with you. We want to engage with you and help you through whatever storm you're facing, whether it's the coronavirus or something bigger, different than that. We want to be available to you. Please don't hesitate to go to our website, icommunitychurch.com. We would love to connect with you. And next week, we're going to be talking about fear, because whenever there's a storm, there is always fear. And we're going to give you some encouragement for that. If you know somebody who could be blessed and encouraged by this or encouraged next week, please share this with them. Click on the share button and send it off to your friends. Invite them to come watch with you next Sunday as we continue in our series, Anchored in the Storm. Let me pray for us as we close our time together this morning. Gracious Heavenly Father, we are in a storm together. We are all in the same boat. Many of us are scared. Many of us are uncertain. We're not sleeping at night. We're feeling anxious. We're feeling this questions and fear. God, I pray that you would help us to take an honest assessment of the things that we are anchoring ourselves to, the things that we are looking to give us purpose in life. And God, would you help us to see whether we're anchoring ourselves to the right thing? Lord, I thank you for the teaching that Jesus gave and the hope that he gave when he said, if you take these words of mine and put them into practice, you are like a wise man who builds his house on the rock. Would we be like that wise man? Would you help us to be wise men and women and teenagers and kids, that we would anchor ourselves into you? God, give us each the wisdom to look and take an honest assessment of our lives this week. And God, help us to take the steps necessary to anchor ourselves into the right thing. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope that you found that message encouraging. And again, as Seth said, if this was encouraging to you and you know someone else who is struggling during this time, I would share this message with them, invite them to watch along with the rest of the series. And just keep asking yourself, what are you anchored to? You know, some people think maybe the light at the end of the storm is in sight. Some people feel like we're right in the middle of it. And it doesn't really matter where you've been at. You have the opportunity to anchor to your Creator, to anchor to the Jesus that we celebrated just last week at Easter. So we would love to see you next week. Thank you again. Have a wonderful week. And we'll see you next week as we continue the series.